Hi, my name is Simon Batchelor. I'm the coordinator for Modern Energy Cooking Services program, working alongside Ed and Yabe and Louise and Jane and far too many people to be able to mention in this opening slide. This presentation is a reflection on year 2 of the program and to contribute to our annual workshop, which this year will of course have to be virtual. So it's possible that some of you don't know what the MECS program is. It's UKAid funded. It started in about October 2018, will finish in September 23, and is a £40 million program. The core premise was that SDG 7 was failing in terms of responding to people's cooking needs, and that improved cook stoves there were a number of reports that said improved cook stoves were not keeping up with population growth and not making a fundamental health difference. So there were a whole load of international organizations that called for a different strategy and an alternative strategy. So since about 2012, some researchers in the UK had been looking ahead and looking at how solar PV prices were coming down, how battery energy storage prices were coming down, and considered that by 2020 it might be possible to create a solar home system that could also cook. And that led into discussions creating the program after some initial sort of background research. I was a little bit hesitant about putting this slide in because it feels like we've been talking about the inadequacies of the biomass cooking response for quite a long time now. And as we got into the program, we realized that for reasons we don't really understand, this establishment of a biomass focused cooking sector barely mentioned electricity at all. So while we got into this through the ideas of solar PV and energy storage, we quickly realized that while international organizations were saying that they were neutral on fuels, they were barely discussing electricity in the context of cooking. And these, it's not an exaggerated story. These reports, if you search for the word electricity in any one of them, you'll find maybe two times electric pops up, and most of those are in the context of households have electric connections. There's no real discussion about the possibilities of cooking with electricity. And you may say, well, hang on, but we've had 2 years worth of the MECS program. Hasn't that changed? Look at the ESMAP Uganda Clean Cooking Behaviour Diagnostic. It still doesn't mention electric. So at a national level and an international level, the discussion about cooking did not include electricity. In the meantime, actually, the energy access sector, if there is such a thing, which I tend to put energy access in brackets electricity, has really gone forward. So there's a massive increasing percentage of the world who are now connected to electricity. Yes, there's still a shortfall of 800 million, and 800 million is a huge sum. And yes, we haven't talked yet about quality of supply, etc. But there has been this progression from 1.2 billion down to 800 million. And over the last sort of 10 years, and that is set to continue into the future as renewables get cheaper, as generating capacity gets stronger, as there is continued investment in this area. And yet, in the same way that within the cooking sector there's very little discussion of electricity, in the electric sector there's very little discussion of cooking. So on the slide I've put an illustration from a 2017 report of IEA, and you see that it lists all the possible uses of cooking, of electricity, but it talks about large appliances. It doesn't actually mention cooking. In contrast, we in the UK, we in developed economies, of course we cook with electricity. In the UK, it's about 50-50 with gas. But although the UK government has now announced that no new build houses will have gas supplies, and in places like Sweden it's about 95%. So cooking with electricity is possible. Question is it affordable? Is it realistic in the context and situations of lower middle income countries? So as we've moved forward and as we've realized that there is this disconnect between the cooking sector ignoring that fuel of electricity and the electric sector ignoring that load profile of cooking, we've increasingly just discussed about, well, how do we get that conversation in the same room? There was a little video made fairly early on, and some of you who were at last year's annual conference would have seen that video, and I've taken snapshots, put it on the slide here. It's about that chasm between the cooking sector and the electric sector. And increasingly we are having the headline that energy access, household energy access, should be a single strategy with a single investment. If I can just go off on investment, you know, the Clean Cooking Alliance reports that 40 million has been spent on the cooking sector each year, annually, for the last 4 or 5 years. Contrast that with 26 billion that was spent in sub-Saharan Africa on electricity generation, both fossil fuel generation and renewables, and transmission, increasing transmission. 32 billion in Southeast Asia, 50 billion in India. You know, and India and China are still the location of a lot of these biomass users. Oh, I got a fly. It reminds me of the Mike Pence fly in the presidential debate. Right, that was a distraction, but this is meant to be slightly informal, so I'm going to carry on. So this contrast between electricity and cooking, I find it encapsulated in Kampala. Kampala is 1.6 million people and is set to double in size over the next 15 to 20 years by inward migration and by population growth. 95% of all households have a grid connection. Uganda has made tremendous gains, going from 2005, when there were massive shortages, through to now. It's tripled its capacity, and I have to confess I'm not clear whether the Karuma Dam is online yet or not, but when it is, there will be a surplus of electricity. Excuse me, it's not COVID. A surplus of electricity with a need for greater demand. And yet 70% of households in Kampala are still cooking with charcoal, with all the respiratory problems which I am adequately demonstrating now, with all the respiratory problems that are associated with that. So we have shown over the last year, the Creek team in Uganda have shown that you can cook traditional Ugandan food in electric pressure cookers, and it's an acceptable taste. And indeed, Uganda has already changed, or at least suggested a change. It's in the draft energy policy that came out in October 2019, that they focus on electric and energy efficient appliances. So we don't want to waste all this energy that's being created. Wastage represents expenditure for the household. And so, you know, what the Creek team have shown is that if you use a hot plate for these traditional Ugandan meals, then the cost of doing that is about the same as LPG. Charcoal is relatively cheaper in Kampala than it is in, say, Nairobi, and so actually with a hot plate charcoal is slightly cheaper. However, when you come to an EPC, which can do long heavy foods with a significant efficiency, then the cost of cooking that meal on electricity is cheaper than charcoal, LPG. It's less than, you know, it's about 1/3 of the cost for a lot of the meals that LPG is. because it's going to make me stress as to whether I should keep all these coughing in and keep it informal or go for some formality. We're all used to Zooms where people are having to cough and accidentally stand up and reveal that they're wearing shorts. So we can, the urban situation in Kampala is a classic example. MEME is a profit-making utility that is getting its act together, that's got a good solid base. Loss of electricity is rare in Kampala now, and so why not shift this? Yeah. So we do get some pushback from people saying, well, hang on, urban areas, what about all the rural areas? Aren't you leaving people behind? That's not our intention. Our intention is to start with the urban areas, which are actually a neglected area. When ESMAP commissioned a systematic review, one of its few headlines was that they couldn't find any urban studies on cooking in low and middle income countries that fitted the criteria. So there's not only been a focus on biomass, but there's been a neglect on urban and peri-urban centres. So again, cities are growing, and most of them are set to double in the next 2 decades by inward migration and by population growth. So there is a strong need to address them. When I was doing my agriculture degree, which is many years ago now, Africa was predominantly rural, but that has changed and is changing quite rapidly. And so someone like the Kampala municipality, they're really worried about how they will get the infrastructure for an increasing population. And if we can reduce the charcoal and reduce the air pollution, then perhaps over the next 15-20 years, when that matches the coming in of electric cars or clean transport, maybe cities will be very different than what they are now. Some people also suggest that we're dreaming. Well, yes, we are dreaming. We want to see the world change. We want to see that climate friendly, climate compatible use of energy. Black carbon is an important element of the climate change equation, and charcoal users are using a lot of wood, whereas a rural household using wood uses about half a ton a year as a rule of thumb. Charcoal users, by the time it's processed and then used, are using about 1 ton. So if we actually only addressed half the population, but that half of population pivoted away from charcoal to clean energy, you'd actually be saving, I don't know, something like 2/3 of the wood fuel combustion of the country. So our focus on urban is because A, it's been neglected, B, they are connected, and C, it still addresses the deforestation, the gender aspects, and in fact many of the urban poor are more vulnerable than their rural cousins because they have so few resources, they have little social capital, and there is a huge opportunity here.
Welcome to Shamba Shape Up. Once again, we have traveled all over East Africa to find hard-working farmers.
We want to celebrate them while giving them the knowledge they need,
so they can adapt and make their farms more productive even while the climate changes.
I'm very hungry. I'm going to look for some food. Nemo, thank you very much for joining us. I had to call you because now we've been here at Paris's Shamba, working very hard. It's lunchtime, I'm feeling hungry. I came to the kitchen and I found you are making matumbo, but it was not ready.
Yes,
and I'm still hungry. So I remembered that Nemo can give us a solution to cooking faster and safely and cheaper.
Yes.
And here you are. Now let me start with you, Paris. How long does it take you to cook matumbo?
2 hours. Boiling and frying.
That's a lot of time that you can spend doing so much, isn't it, Nemo?
Yes, 2 hours is a very long time. I've come with a pressure cooker to help you reduce that time so that you can feed your family on time.
You said when you're cooking matumbo, you are spending almost 2 hours.
Yes.
What normally do you use when you're cooking food like matumbo?
Charcoal.
Charcoal.
Yes.
And how much is one tin?
1 tin is 150.
Paris uses 2 tins of charcoal that cost her 300 shillings. And now she's going to spend how much time cooking matumbo?
It takes roughly between 30 minutes and 40 minutes. Yes, depending on how tender you want your matumbo to be.
The matumbo will be ready with 30 minutes.
And at what cost?
So the cost, it will depend with the amount of time that you use, and it will average between 8 shillings and 12 shillings.
You can see how much money you'll be saving.
Thank you very much.
So let's put in the onions. Add some oil. Then garlic and ginger. Let's put in our tomatoes. Some seasoning, add some salt. And finally the matumbo. Add some water, stir, and then cover. Cancel the saute program and set the pressure cooker to cook the matumbo, and that's it. You can even go and do other chores as you wait for it to cook. So, is our food ready?
Yes, it is.
How long did it take?
It took 40 minutes to cook the matumbo to tenderness, and it cost us 6 shillings and 94 cents.
Wow. Paris uses 300 shillings on charcoal and takes 2 hours to make matumbo using a charcoal burner. But with a pressure cooker, she's used 6 shillings and 94 cents and took 40 minutes to cook the same matumbo. What do you think of that, Paris?
I think it's perfect. It's very efficient.
So now, servers, let's have a taste and see.
Yes. There is our matumbo.
Nice aroma.
Very tender and very sweet.
This is what I was looking forward to. And I think mission accomplished.
Yes.
Thank you.
Daniel was impressed by how efficient and cost-effective the electric pressure cooker was.
So how is MECS going to get to this transition? Well, we're obviously making partnerships at many different levels. One of our key partners is ESMAP of the World Bank. ESMAP have a long tradition in energy access, and they tackle both cooking and electrification, and they influence the rest of the World Bank. One of the things that one of the publications that they recently launched is the state of access to modern energy cooking, and that was recently launched, and that's an analysis of national data to see where we are, and also to calculate some scenarios that might get us closer to SDG 7 by 2030. Their ideal scenario requires $150 billion a year, but although that sounds a huge amount, of that, about 100 billion is consumer finance that pivots from biomass expenditure to modern energy expenditure, and of course that is a potential revenue for the utilities. So that 100 billion that they calculate is actually quite attractive for this whole proposition of make a single investment in electrification and then you've got the revenue coming in. The second report that is launched as part of this week actually is going to be Cooking with Electricity, a Cost Perspective. Again, an ESMAP report, although it builds on the work of John Leary, Matt Leach, a little bit myself as authors, but building on work done by a lot of the team across the whole of MECS. That shows that electricity is cheaper to cook with than other fuels in some scenarios, in some contexts, and uses empirical data for that and modeling to extend it, what it might look like into the future. That should be a great advocacy and influencing document, and it should be able to go to the electrification lending part of the development finance institutions and be able to build them, get them to consider cooking, if they can see that it's a cost-effective proposition. I mean, just 2 days ago, I was talking to someone who works with the World Bank all the time, and they were telling me that they actually had a conversation with the officer on the ground in a particular country who was doing a 350 million expansion of the grid, extending the access. And when he started talking about cooking and saying, are you allowing for cooking load profiles? The officer turned around and said, no, that's not within my remit. These are the people that we have to try and capture, so that we're not just isolating 10 million in order to do a bespoke cooking program, but actually we're getting utilities, ministries of energy, energy regulation authorities to consider how cooking is embedded into the electrification. Finally, on ESMAP, they are continuing to use their multi-tier framework to analyze and monitor progress and to give us insights into country. The multi-tier framework looks at the quality of electricity, and it looks at the quality of the cooking experience. And in that sense, it's a great step forward. It's been really brilliant, because previously national data was a single question on what is your primary cooking fuel. And so if somebody was cooking 60% of the time with LPG and stacking it with 40% of charcoal, the answer was LPG. And so the statistics were skewed because they were still getting health problems. Oh dear. No, that wasn't a staged cough, just because I'm talking about health problems again. It's a coincidence. So still getting health problems from, say, the charcoal or the stacked fuel, but it wasn't being reflected in the data. The multi-tier framework is great because it asks questions like whether you've got a window and whether you're cooking inside or outside. Again, you know, with urban cooking, you know, people are shut in very small confined housing. With rural, actually you could cook outside some of the time, and if you've got a decent wind blowing the smoke away, we all have sat around barbecues and know the difference. So the multi-tier framework has modules on electricity and modules on cooking. Again, because of the divide I keep talking about, those two modules barely touch each other. And one of the things we've been doing is reanalyzing some of the MTF data to try and make that connection, to find out whether people have electrical appliances, rice cookers, kettles, and what that does to influence their cooking. So as part of the program, we have to engage at high level policy. We are, of course, generating data at the field level, but high level policy influencing is an important thing to us. You can probably recognize that it was Ed who wrote this particular slide. Let me just try and read it. For this new narrative to gain the ascendancy within the global community will require considerable effort in galvanizing political support and building momentum. Sorry, I felt it was a bit like Tricky Dicky at that point. But yeah, it's really important that we engage at a high level policy environment. It's not enough to just produce research. We are actually seeking to change the narrative globally, and therefore it's really important that we engage with SE for All. Ed is part of this high-level political platform that was convened by WHO and Kanda Keller, and we have also had interactions with parliamentarians through the Climate Parliament. So I believe that we're moving forward in terms of high-level policy influence. So that's at the sort of policy political level, but we are also looking at supply chains and getting these devices into the country. And to do that, we've picked up on these commercially available electric pressure cookers. You can buy them in your local shop. If you're in the UK, you can get them off Amazon. And we have been looking to how can we encourage them into sub-Saharan Africa to be more available on the shops. When we started, they were not available at all, but now they're beginning to, and certainly in Kenya there's been some fantastic movement forward in terms of Kenya Power actually promoting them. We've had Shamba Chef who are actually telling people about them, and that has stimulated people to actually ask, well, where can I buy one? So it's all about getting the supply chains in place. We've been talking to the Chinese factories to make sure that we're getting the high quality ones at the cheapest possible price. And indeed, there has been a sort of Which magazine assessment of safety features and of usability through an organization called CLASP. And all the time we're aware of the cultural sensitivities of cooking food. And so we're trying to get our southern partners to actually cook with these devices and to make sure that they can actually do things like matoke, the famous Ugandan meal that you have to wrap in banana leaves and yeah. So it's important to for us. We have found an energy efficient device which seems to fulfill a lot of people's cooking needs. And that's great. But we're also stimulating innovation. Those devices are for strong AC grids that, and so their power levels are relatively high at a kilowatt plus. And so there's possibilities about lower power devices. We still have that energy storage in mind, and we're doing some research, action research on the energy storage. I mean, energy storage is an interesting one. The price per lithium battery that was predicted to be in 2020 at 2015, when some of the pre-MECS research was being done, the price now in 2020 is lower than that prediction. And the curve is actually lower than we thought it would be at that point. So it's becoming more and more of a reality. There are power hubs. Crest has been designing power hubs, but actually there are now power hubs on commercial sites such as Amazon and Alibaba, and they hold a very interesting future. You know, if we show the role of energy storage, they'll be able to take that forward. But there's also some real innovations in terms of thermal storage, so phase change material, locally made equipment, and of course there's innovations in LPG and ethanol and all sorts of things. And none of those innovations and none of the companies that we're talking to will be able to go forward without the finance. People are aware of the upfront cost for the household, which may be a challenge, and they are also aware of the profitability for the companies that may be slightly long term. And so it's about enabling finance at these various levels. As I said, the ESMAP have introduced a Clean Cooking Fund, which is a co-benefits results-based finance. We're also working with NDEV on results-based finance of EPCs in Kenya, looking at to work with Norway in Zambia on results-based financing. But then there's also we've been working with Cardano and Climate Care to use carbon funding to mitigate the cost of appliances. So we're looking all the time for early patient capital. So we've invested in Acumen, we've investing about to in Spark Plus, which is hosted by CCA, but has an injection of capital from the African Development Bank, and we've commissioned studies on the best way to enable the finance. I mean, the exciting one for me is the crowdfunding, and we're not there yet, but I can really see how something like toilet twinning, which worked quite well with the UK, we could actually start looking at our electrical appliances in our own kitchens and do some twinning there, or just getting crowdfunding that might overcome. So there's traditional finance, the development finance institutions, and there we're exploring alternative types of finance. I keep talking about electrical, and I throw in every now and then the LPG. Well, it's important to know that LPG is likely to be useful as a transition fuel. I do reiterate that for me, and I speak personally, not for the whole team, but for me, a single investment strategy. You've put in your generator, you're running your wires to the household. You now only have to stimulate that household to get an electrical appliance, and they can be cooking. Whereas as soon as you do LPG, you've got to be, you've got to have a port that imports the LPG. You then got to have distributors. People have got to make sure they redo their bottle. LPG is more fun to cook with, I'll give you that. But you know, I mean, in many places the costs, India, Ecuador, Indonesia, LPG has had to be subsidized, and that means that the governments are paying out quite a lot. But again, I'm often accused of being too down on LPG and too much electricity. I fully acknowledge that I'm not fuel neutral like many of my colleagues. I see it as about investment, and you're trying to stimulate investment in a fossil fuel as opposed to utilizing the increasing investment in renewables. Having said that, we have invested in a study on bio-LPG, and bio-LPG holds some fantastic promise, and we're already attracting some investors, having just done an initial study alongside the University of Liverpool, Surrey, and GLPGP. And also, interestingly, the Cooking with Electricity report I mentioned earlier by ESMAP, actually a clean stack of LPG and EPC is really good, because LPG is good for flash frying, for your stir fry, etc., whereas an EPC is really good for your long-term boiling of beans. So actually bringing those two together will be quite interesting. What about cooking outside of homes? Well, the more observant of you will have noticed these two pressure cookers in the background. That's an ordinary one, and that is a 33-litre one. It's commercially available, and we're exploring that as to whether that could be used for school meals, institutional meals. Excuse me. We want to displace the wood, which is causing respiratory diseases. I've used that joke before, so now I'm into dad joking. Yes, we are exploring that. We're working with the World Food Programme, who have the beginnings of a 10-year strategy to help many schools transition from biomass to modern energy cooking. We've developed a curriculum with UNITAR for teaching to UNHCR staff for use in humanitarian situations. And each of these institutions, humanitarians, and something that we're calling modern eating habits, all have landscape documents that have been produced during the year and are available for consultation. Modern eating is actually acknowledging that people's habits are changing. So actually, people are coming home from work and buying their food from street vendors already hot. So it's a question of, do those street vendors pivot to modern energy cooking? How much can urban workers, how much are they actually substituting? We found that in one of the Nairobi studies, 25% of meals were reheated. Now that means either reheated because it was yesterday's leftovers, or reheated because they bought a ready meal on the street. Now that's not a robust data point. It was too small a sample, but over the coming year we will seek to identify that and see if there are ways of engaging with the broader food industry in order to save cooking energy and enhance the whole capability of people to transition from biomass to modern energy cooking. So 2020 has of course been marked by COVID, and it has slowed things down. We have kept working, but there aren't as many field studies as perhaps we would have liked. We've had endless Skype calls, Zoom calls, as I expect many of you have. There is a working paper that was drawn together in, I think, March or April, It still hasn't been spell corrected and sorted out, and we are thinking of publishing it as a properly sorted out publication. But it picked up on this idea that people are talking about building back better, and what we're suggesting is that COVID recovery funds could be used to unlock modern energy cooking, which would in turn unlock the health, because COVID kills by comorbidity, and you've got non-communicable diseases. It would unlock some of the environment and this movement towards climate carbon zero. And it would also release time for women. One of the things that really struck me when I was working with Tanzanian women was how much they appreciated the being able to switch on the EPC and then walk away, do something else, and then come back to it. And the other thing they say a lot is cleanliness. They love the idea that they can start with a clean clothing, and by the time they finish the meal, they are still with clean clothing. They haven't been bending over a hot stove and sweating and getting charcoal dust on them or whatever. Anyway, the working paper, Cooking, Health, Energy, Environment and Gender, was presented by the Kenyan government to the UN summit, and there is a video was made for that occasion to summarize it. So where do we go for year 3? Well, we seem to be in a good position. I of course am impatient that we're not further along, but I think you know, a lot of the action research is a little incomplete. We had challenges in contracting people, so that delayed things. Then we got hit by COVID, so you know, okay, I would like it further on, but basically we are in a good position. We've made reasonable gains in getting the cooking sector to consider electricity, but I think we have a long way to go to get those who are working in electricity to consider cooking. But let's acknowledge that we're dealing with a complex system, and we are seeking a significant change, as well as documenting action research. So we're very pleased that we got an A+ for our year 2, and we hope to get that for year 3. Year 3 will be about scaling, actually trying to take some of these ideas further up scale. And so 2021, you know, we've got some advantages. We've got the fact that the electricity demand has dropped, and so many utilities are currently looking for other ways to actually use more electricity. I haven't said, but you know, there's so much research I could have said, and I hope it comes up in other places. Mini grids, often not profitable, often need households to use more electricity than they do, and you know, the cooking is a possibility there. So we have some solid action research building on a growing evidence base, and the world is talking about building back better. It's talking about more green, more renewables, and the renewables are continuing to drop in price. Some of the price points of large-scale solar concentrators is just amazing, 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So and Ethiopia has put one of those in recently. So don't fall into the trap of looking backwards and thinking that, you know, all of this is too challenging with bad electrical grid networks. The electrical grid networks are improving dramatically and rapidly. I'm going to leave it there. I've spoken for far too long. My machine is telling me that it's 35 minutes and it was supposed to be 20 minutes max. Okay, but we're doing well. Let's carry on, push on.